start directly. We're not waiting for people to join. We go.
No. Nobody joins yet. Ready? Go.
Ça fait rêver, ça fait vibrer, ça fait danser. Oh, Africa, ça fait rêver, ça fait vibrer, ça fait danser. Oh, Africa, Bariula, Banagaya, Pesata Sorona, Bakalilela, la Guinée, le Congo, Sénégal, le Bénin. Yaoundé, oh, quel beau pays. Africa, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh. Africa, 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 oh, Africa, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh. Africa, 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 oh, Africa, oh, yeah, oh.
Hello everyone, bonjour à toutes et bonjour à tous. Merci de vous être connectés cet après-midi pour découvrir ensemble le résultat du top 100 des marques les plus admirées en Afrique en 2021. Je suis Dorothée Alali, directrice exécutive associée chez Integrate Consulting, une filiale du groupe Kantar qui a réalisé cette étude à travers 28 pays en Afrique, soit 50% du continent, en partenariat avec Géopol. Aujourd'hui avec nous, TB Ikalafeng et Karine Duchesne. Hello Karine, hello TB.
Allô Dorothy. Très bien, merci beaucoup. Et vous?
Thanks for joining us in this session. You will share the results of the top 100 most admired brands in Africa. You will also cover the French-speaking countries and Moroccan results. I will
Correct.
introduce you both in French, so people will know you better. So I will switch to French. En effet, donc pour les gens qui se connectent, nous avons avec nous deux spécialistes de l'Afrique. Tout d'abord, Karine Duchesne, Chief Growth Officer Africa Middle East chez Kantar. Elle a plus de 25 ans d'expérience en marketing, communication et customer experience auprès de clients locaux et internationaux dans de nombreux pays et régions d'Afrique. Karine va se charger de nous présenter l'approche méthodologique de ce beau projet qui a déjà plus de 11 ans. Elle sera suivie par TB Ikalafeng, qui est le fondateur du mouvement Brand Africa, qui inspire et fait la promotion de la marque en Afrique à travers le monde. Il est l'un des porte-parole majeurs de la marque Afrique en tant que fondateur d'une société de conseil et de réputation panafricaine, Brand Leadership, ainsi qu'une académie, Africa Brand Leadership Academy, qui forme des entrepreneurs, des exécutifs ou des étudiants à mieux s'approprier la culture et la richesse de la marque Afrique, afin de connaître et faire reconnaître les marques africaines auprès des consommateurs africains et au-delà. Donc la session va se dérouler en 3 temps. On aura tout d'abord la présentation de Karine qui va parcourir l'approche méthodologique qui est menée sur 28 pays d'Afrique, et notamment la partie méthodologique sur le Maroc que nous avons suivi. Ensuite, elle passera la parole à TB qui va nous révéler les différents résultats Afrique, Afrique francophone et le Maroc. Nous aurons ensuite une session de questions et réponses selon effectivement le temps qui nous sera encore accordé. Donc, n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions dans la zone de commentaires et nous les reprendrons tous dans la mesure du possible. Bonne session à vous. Up to you, Karine.
Merci, Dorothy. It's so lovely to be here. Bonjour, Morocco. I wish I was there with you today, one of my favorite countries in Africa. But alas, with COVID, it is not to be. We are here in our virtual world, and still we have exciting news for you today. So let me tell you a little bit more about Brand Africa 100 and how it all works. I wish I could be sharing in French today, but I'm afraid my French does not go much beyond greetings and other such things. So let's move straight on to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. So let me tell you a little bit about Kantar. So Kantar is a research and insights agency. There's a cat making a noise. Sorry about that. We basically focus on understanding people, what they do, how they feel, and we help our brands to grow by understanding this. I'm just going to, if you don't mind, get this cat out. The joy of work from home is you get a special guest, le chat. So, if we wouldn't mind just going back to the previous slide. I also wanted to say a huge thank you this afternoon actually, to Integrate, who is our affiliate in Morocco. It's so wonderful to have brand experts like Dorothy and Shiham join us today, as these ladies have both been working on brands for many years and have great understanding of what makes a successful brand in Morocco. So thank you for hosting us today. Right, let's move on to the study itself. So this brand Africa 100 has been running now for 11 years. It really is the authoritative study on brands in Africa. We're very proud of the work that's been done, and we hope that you are inspired by those brands that are really making it in Africa today. So let me tell you about the study itself. We have got incredible coverage across the continent. We go west, we go east, we go south, we go north, we go central. We've got all the major economies. 80% of the population of Africa is covered in this year's study. Next slide. So largely, the methodology we employ across the continent is to use mobile surveys with our partner Geopol. We've got an incredible network across the country that we can use, and then Kantar correlates the data and puts it into the 100, does the classification and all the weighting of the data to build the index. So as I've said, Geopol has great coverage across the continent. Unfortunately, they're not yet operational in Morocco. So we have used in Morocco, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. We have not used SMS or mobile web as we do elsewhere. We actually go straight to, if you wouldn't mind going to the face-to-face slide. Next one. In Morocco, because we have quite a lot of diversity of people, some people that are very comfortable doing mobile surveys and others that are not, we decided to rather use an extensive coverage by using face-to-face interviews across the 7 big cities of the country. In total, we interviewed 600 people that were aged over. Our next slide, please. So the study is quite comprehensive in terms of what it covers. The first and most important question completely is the Brand Africa Index. Now, this question asks respondents to tell us what are the 3 brands that you admire the most. This could be from any category, whatever it is that's resonating with you as a consumer. So we have quite a lot of diversity of categories that are covered there. After we've done that, we then asked, tell us what is the brand that's made in Africa that you admire the most. Again, we asked for people to give us at least 3 answers of those brands. Once that's done, we move into financial services, because this is such an important driver of action and movement of money across the continent. And we finish up with looking at what is the most admired media brand in the continent. And this is really important because it is the media, the television stations, the radio stations, the digital platforms, the print platforms that help us to build great brands in our continent. So it's a great thanks to them, and that's why we've included it. And we get the next slide. And this year, we added an additional question: which brand has been effective in terms of helping during COVID? This has been a very difficult year for everybody and a complete change to our lives, a real upheaval, and we wanted to know which brands have been supportive during this period. We can move. So out of all of that, we get over 80,000 answers from people. It's a huge, massive data, a great exercise to try and bring this into some sense of order, classifying, coding, cleaning the data to get us to the 3,500 individual brand mentions that we receive to build the overall index. Next. We have some internet delay, I think. The signal is coming to us from Côte d'Ivoire today. So once we've done that, we spend all the time sorting out the brands and building up these brands into the overall index. We can move to the next. Quite an exercise, I must tell you. We then do a very scientific process in which we create a weighted average index that takes into account the sample size and the population size of each of the countries covered to ensure that we have a fully representative picture of the brands in Africa. To make it to the top 100 list, you do have to be mentioned in at least one country other than your own country. So this is a study around Pan-African brands to be on the top 100. And if you're only local, then you can only qualify in your country list. So let's talk a little bit about the brands and how things have been impacted since 2020, which was a crazy year, COVID impacting so much. Some categories, such as the ones shown here, next slide, have really benefited from this COVID period. Those that are offering germ protection, sanitization, cleansing have been affected very positively. However, some others have not been affected as positively. Sport had a tough time. It was put on hold for many months and we had to watch reruns. But despite that, the brands that sponsor football are the ones that people love. The brands that are operating in the soft drink category or categories that were in restaurants had to work harder to impact people. And fashion has moved to informal rather than formal, as people love to work from home in their tracksuit pants. So those brands that have worked hard are still resonating in consumers' minds. And it's been a year where it might have been a little bit more difficult and we had to be more innovative, but still we see the great brands shining through. So one of the things we love to see every year is how important the beautiful fabrics of Africa are to people. And in every country, we see them being mentioned. What consumers want is they want durable products that have got great design. They love to have the latest phone and the best one they can get to optimize their needs. And we've seen that 2020 and early 2021 have seen a huge acceleration in terms of online purchasing and delivery. Many people were afraid of buying things online before, but now they'd rather buy online than go out of their homes. They're trying to stay as local as possible and not get infected by the virus. Oopsie. So despite the fact that sport was on hold, we've seen that the power of football is very strong, and across the continent, football brand sponsors are coming through very strongly. And if you can connect with the sports stars of the continent, your brand will be noted. Next, please. Brands such as Guinness, which is operating in West Africa, has also sponsored football and are known to be more like an African brand than a global brand. Next, please. So, handsets, as I've said, are vital, and it's quite incredible to see how strong companies like this Chinese brand Techno have been in terms of becoming one of the most popular handsets in the continent. They know how to distribute and they know how to bring the price points that enable people to buy the phone that they want. Automotive, we've also seen some local innovation in the automotive market. Brands like Innocent and Katanka coming through, offering a bit of ruggedness and a good price point for the African market. And there are some wonderful local conglomerates that are expanding out of their local country and building strong brands that are Pan-African brands. Brands such as Dangote, Azam were mentioned in particular. And of course, the strong global brands that have been here for many, many years, investing and making sure that they distribute effectively across the continent, are also noted by people. Coca-Cola has actually been operating in Africa for over 90 years, and it's no surprise that it is one of our top brands in the continent. We see that mobile operators are an essential partner in brand building across the country, because this is how we access our data, right? And brands such as MTN were mentioned in 15 countries. And in each of the countries, we see that the mobile operators are really important. They're a part of our lives. So when we were asked specifically about African brands, what's quite interesting to see is that many international brands are actually perceived to be African. And that is because they really understand what African consumers want and need, and they resonate very closely with what people are looking for in a brand. So I encourage you to continue to think locally, act globally in terms of how you execute, but make sure you continue to look for those local insights and meet people's needs where they're at. Brands like Nike have really identified those key sports stars across the continent, such as Caster Semenya, the Kenyan runner, fast as he is. They've identified influencers like Starboy, and of course designers that they allow to execute their designs on their shoes so that we can really stand out and be noted as truly African. So well done, Nike, for localizing. So without further ado, I think it's really important that we get into the meat of today's presentation, which is the results themselves, to understand what are the top brands in Africa, and in particular, which brands are really up there in Morocco. So I'm going to hand over now to Tebe Ekalafeng. Tebe is the founder and chairperson of Brand Africa, and he is very passionate about building brands. He's visited every country in Africa, and I'm sure he is very excited to share the findings with you today. Over to you, Tebe.
Thank you so much, Karen. Bonjour, Africa. Bonjour, Maroc. Bonjour, Dorothy, Isam, Siam, and Karine. So the French say Karen. They don't say Karen. They say Karine. So looking forward to this, to sharing with you the results this evening. We're going to start Pan-Afrique. We're going to start at the beginning of the continent and share the results broadly from the continent, and then narrow them down to Francophone, the French brands, and then we're going to talk about Morocco brands. So what is the big finding? The biggest finding when you look at the African brands versus the non-African brands, that only 13% of the brands that Africans admire are African. So only 13%. So it shows there's an 80% gap between what Africans aspire to in the continent, or what they support, certainly in the continent. Most of the brands are sub-Sahara from Western Africa, from West Africa in Nigeria, Southern Africa in South Africa, Kenya and Ethiopia. I mean, Kenya, Ethiopia, the two big brands, Ethiopian Airways, which is the biggest airline in the continent, perhaps one of the biggest ones in the world, one that survived COVID. Matter of fact, it thrived during COVID. And then Pesa, which is the most admired worldwide brand for mobile money transfer. Everybody copies Pesa. So let's go into the results. Number one, most admired brand in Africa. Number three, Samsung. Number two, Adidas. The most admired, le plus admiré, la marque africaine, Nike. So Nike has an incredible history in the continent. Has been one of the strongest brands for the last 4 years, has been number one in the continent, has rose dramatically from the time when we started the rankings in 2010. So the top 10 brands in the continent, none are from Africa. MTN from South Africa used to be in the top 10, but now it's number 11 out of the top 100 brands in the continent. If you look at the most admired African brand, when you ask the question, what is the most admired African brand? Dangote is number one. When you ask, what is the most admired brand in Africa? MTN is number one. So MTN, Dangote, your two strongest African brands. Most admired media brand in Africa, number one. Number three, CNN. BBC was number one for 10 years. In the 11th year, BBC loses the top spot to DSTV. Why? Because DSTV is the brand that brings us Netflix, the brand that brings us Amazon, brings us Showtime. You will remember that during COVID, everybody was staying home. And when they are home, what did they used to do? Watch streams, watch pay-as-you-go movies. And DSTV became the brand, top of mind brand that they consider, that they admire for doing that for them. Top 10 brands in the continent. Number 6, French, Canal Plus. Numbers 10, RFI, French. Americans, CNN, Facebook, Netflix, and BBC, as I've said. Let's look at financial services. When it comes to financial services, ABSA. You will recall ABSA bought most of Sub-Sahara, used to be part of Barclays. So ABSA bought all the Barclays assets back and rebranded the whole continent from Sub-Sahara Africa into ABSA, giving them very prominent eyes to the African consumers. Number 3. Number 2, First Bank from Nigeria, one of the oldest banks from Nigeria. The number 1 most admired bank in the continent across board, GT Bank. GT Bank, they're in fashion, they're in technology, they're in service. That's how they are going to distinguish themselves into the future. They position themselves as a future bank. This is the 2nd year they are in the list. You can see the list, all African. It's an all African list of the most admired brands in the continent. I think there's 2 Francophone brands, EcoBank and Bank of Africa from Mali and from Togo. If you look at the question that Karen brought up earlier, we asked the question, what is the most admired brand during COVID? What did the consumers say? What did the African citizens say? They say number 1 is WHO. So WHO, we know why. Because during the pandemic, they were top of mind. Followed by MTN, the highest ranking African brand. We know why MTN is there. They donated to 9 African countries over 9 million vaccines during COVID. So they were quite active, not just from their SMSs, from their communication, but also in physically contributing towards the pandemic, elevating the pandemic. Central African brand, Samsung, number 1. North African, Nike, number 1. Southern Africa, Adidas, number 1. West Africa, Samsung, number 1. And then East Africa, Nike, number 1. Nike, Samsung, very strong brands, always been in the lists. When you look at the categories dominated by consumer. Non-technical represent about 20%, the computers, 17%, auto, 13%. Luxury is interesting. That's where you see brands like Gucci. Gucci, don't worry that the Gucci you see in that people wear is all counterfeit or fake. It's okay. It's an aspiration brand. They buy it from the fake stories, but they don't care. They aspire for the right brand. And that's how luxury brands go in here. The brands like Ferrari, brands like Dolce & Gabbana, brands like Louis Vuitton, and those brands, the reason they are here is not because people are buying them, but it's because they aspire to them. Remember, this is an admiration study. It's a study of the brands that consumers have great admiration for. So Karen spoke earlier about the brands that Africans think they are African. So when we ask the question, what is your most admired African brand? What did they do? We isolated the brands that are not African, which were in the list. Brands like Coca-Cola, brands like Nike, Techno. We had a fascinating discussion with Techno earlier in the earlier session in Nigeria. Flisco, Samsung, Airtel, Telecommunications Vodacom, and Guinness. You're familiar with all these brands because these brands are part of our everyday lives. That's why consumers, that's why citizens of Africa take them to be African brands. If you look at the category leaders, sports, electronics, Ethiopian, I spoke about it. DSTV, I spoke about it. MTN, I spoke about Gucci. We know Google would be there because everyone was searching for information. If you look at the top 100, if you look at the brands by country, the number one brand in every country, Morocco, Samsung, Benin, Adidas, Botswana, Nike. These are the brands out of the, these are the top brands out of every country that we isolated in the survey. So at the end of this week, the report is out, Africa's best brands. I think with African business, it will be our 10th or 9th report from African business. And you can see the focus of the story. African brands defy the pandemic. Why do we say so? If you look at what happened during the pandemic, a lot of brands decided, a lot of local brands decide are putting a lot of energy into cultivating themselves, into building themselves, into sustainability. Brands like Safaricom, brands like Ethiopian Airways, which reimagined them, and then a young brand out of South Africa called Batu, all the way in the top 10 among African brands. And you say top 10 among African brands, what do they do? During the pandemic, they opened 10 new shops. During the pandemic, they signed up one of the biggest stars with over 4 million followers in the continent. During the pandemic, they partnered with Castle Light and built their brand around and created a limited show around the continent. So that's how some of the brands do. We say that they really defied the pandemic. So let's look at the top 10 French brands. So we then said, let's look at how France is doing on the list. The top 10 brands in France, which are French brands in Africa: Orange, number 1, Louis Vuitton, number 2, Lacoste, Chanel, Dior, Danone, Peugeot, Chef, what's the Peugeot? I forget what that one is called now, but Givenchy and Carrefour. So those are the top 10 brands in the continent. Orange always top of the list in the continent when you look at the most admired French brands in the continent. So let's look at the top Francophone Africa brands. I love this map. I haven't seen it before, but I was searching and they said this is the Francophone map. If it is, it's my favorite because it looks like it combines all the other Francophone dominant identities. Love it. Top 10 most admired brands, Francophone African brands. Number 1, Samsung. Number 2, Nike, Adidas, Techno, Apple, Gucci, Orange, Toyota, Intel, and Coca-Cola. How interesting. Not a single African brand among Francophone Africa's top 10 brands. So again, I always say it's a challenge for Africans. It's a challenge for Africans because we need to compete. We cannot get rid of the global brands. We shouldn't get rid of them. We should keep them as the standard. But they are doing something that we are not doing as African brand builders. So top 10 Francophone brands, all dominated by non-African brands. From China, brands like Techno, Gucci, Italy, France, Orange, America obviously dominates, South Korea. It's quite a mixed bag. But we know these brands because these brands, they invest a lot of money in building the equity across the continent. So let's move to the brands from Morocco. From the brands from Morocco, le marque le plus admirée au Maroc. Numéro 3, Nike. Numéro 2, Adidas. And numéro 1, Samsung. Samsung is the number 1 most admired brand in Morocco. So you see the list from Morocco: Adidas, Zara, Nike, Apple, Mercedes, Coca, Huawei, LG, Oppo. No African brand in the top 10. So that's, I think you're seeing the picture already. That which explains why only 13% of the brands that Africans from Cape to Cairo admire are not only 13% are African, because we haven't we associate and we admire non-African brands before. Most admired Moroccan brands: Inui, AfCFTA. Number 1 Moroccan brand, Maroc Telecom. Maroc is such an interesting brand because it's so dominant in the rankings, very dominant as a parastatal. It's very unusual to see a state-owned brand so dominant. So it'll be quite interesting next time I come to Morocco to try and understand why is this brand so strong in Morocco. In the top 10, you're familiar with the brands. Mara at number 9 is always featured in the rankings. In the 10 years, we've always seen a Mara somewhere in the rankings. It's an African brand among the top 100 or somewhere in the rankings. So it's quite. I've never. Every time I go to Morocco, I always say I need to see this brand to understand what's so amazing, why it always features. But I'm quite astounded by Maroc Telecom. Most admired Moroccan media brands: M1, number 2, and 2M as number 1. Number 1 most admired media brand in Morocco. Now it's important when one sees brands that media brands should be local brands, because they care about the country. They will tell a better story about a country. They will tell a more informed story about the country. When you come to the continent, we always battle with how non-African media or non-local media tell the story from our countries. If you look at the report, that 63% of international media that reports on Africa do not have a foreign correspondent in Africa. That's a challenge, that we don't have a correspondent in Africa. So who is going to tell the story of Africa if we don't have a storyteller here in the continent? So that's why I'm excited when I see very strong Moroccan brands in media. Most admired financial services brands in Morocco: Attijariwaba, CIH, number 1, Banque Populaire. Interesting, Banque Populaire, because Banque Populaire as a brand is quite a dominant brand across the continent. Not necessarily always the same one, but as a bank, but Morocco just dominates with this brand. This brand is very, very strong. This brand made it all the way in the top among the most admired African brands because it's recalled outside of Morocco as well. You look at the brands that you are familiar with, the continent. Then we look at COVID. When we look at COVID, we wanted to understand which brands are admired for having been helpful during the pandemic. AfCFTA, CNSS, number 1, Maroc Telecom. I can only imagine what Morocco did. I can imagine Morocco was sending a lot of messages, was the one way people could communicate, but I don't know the facts. And I'm quite excited and interested to understand how Morocco did so well across the continent. But if you look at the brands, Morocco, CNSS, AfCFTA, Orange, Unveil. So in the top 5, Orange, most dominant non-Moroccan brand. Morocco Telecom, most dominant Moroccan brand. It's quite interesting because they're both telecommunication. One is private sector, non-Moroccan, and one is state-owned Moroccan brand. So what is the conclusion? We have lost a bit of ground, but still at 13% of brands being African. But we haven't lost ground in that we're still at 13% of brands being African. But it is a challenge. I said earlier, if 63% of Africans prefer local, then it's time to focus on local economies. So that's why you are seeing now during COVID, there's a focus on building strong local brands. Because during COVID, we learned one thing. The international brands were focused more in terms of what they are going to do for their countries, for their citizens. We should be focusing on what we're doing for our citizens. The things that we need to be looking at, making it easy to travel across the continent, whether it's the passport, whether it's the air transport market. It's complicated for me, having gone to all 54 countries in the continent, traveling from South Africa all the way to the top of the continent to Tunis, took me 35 visas, took me 12 passports. Sometimes I had to leave the continent to come back to the continent. So that's a challenge. We're looking at the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is coming to place now. When that happens well, which brands are going to move across the continent? Our job is to build strong Moroccan brands that can move across the continent, strong African brands that can move across the continent, because the goal is by 2030, 9 years from now, 50% of intra-Africa trade should be 50% of there should be 50% of intra-Africa trade. We are at 18% now. In 9 years, we are going to try and do what we couldn't do for 50 years. COVID is a problem as well as an opportunity for us to build our economies. How are we going to do it? We must buy Africa and build Africa. We must invest in brands, partner in brands. We must promote investing in African brands. And that's why we started this initiative a few months ago about encouraging African brands to participate in the African agenda. The brands that come in that we want to support, they must be created in Africa, registered and traded in Africa, compliant in Africa, tech compliant. They must employ at least one person. They must be serving African consumers. Why is this such an important initiative? Because we've learned from brands like during COVID, we've learned that as a brand, for you to be sustainable, you must be present as well as helpful. That brings me to the end. And I will hand over to Madam Ali from Integrated Consulting to pick it up from here and build on the conversation.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Tebe, for all these very rich insights. So we have a look on the questions. I noticed a few of them. I think one of the key topic is, of course, the crisis of the COVID. So one question for you would be, according to you, how the law affected by the crisis? Do we see some differences between the local African brand versus the more international brands?
What a very, very good question. You see, with the local brands, and I was explaining to an earlier group, that the local brands, in another study of Brand Africa, when we look at the ages of the brands, we looked at how international brands have been, on average, about 80 years old, versus local brands which are 40 years old, which means that local brands, international brands are more rooted in the continent. You look at a brand like Coca-Cola, it's been in the continent for almost 100 years. That means that they have built very, very strong foundations in the continent and are able to withstand some of these challenges. But having said so, this COVID has also been an opportunity for young brands, for brands which don't have legacy problems, to be able to reimagine themselves, because they are much more agile and they can take risks and they can change much faster than established brands. So the challenge is, to your question, which has been affected more, local brands or international brands? I think local brands, because now I think local brands, because the international brands, as you saw, we think they're local. They are pretty rooted in the continent. The challenge is with local brands, they don't have the support and they don't have the finances that the international brands have got. But that's why you're seeing the young brands are much more agile. But then if you look at brands such as Ethiopian Airways, how agile they were, how they were able to reimagine themselves, turn themselves into more cargo, turn themselves to helping with COVID, looking at changing their schedule around. They survived. They survived this. But in the airline industry, nobody else survived. From I'm sure Morocco Air, I'm sure Egypt Air, I'm sure South African, I'm sure all the major African airlines could not survive the COVID. But the brand like Ethiopian became much stronger because they were much more agile. But they were not only agile, they were also supported by the government, which made it easy for them to survive.
Thank you. Another interesting question would be, what, according to you, what would be the success factor for the local or African brands to raise their profile and impact better versus the international brand? How can we fight against these big, very rooted international brands?
I think we have one advantage on them. We are African, we are Moroccan, we are South African, we are Kenyan, we are Ethiopian. We understand our consumers better. We need to build on what makes us different, not trying to compete with the international brands on what makes us like them. The mistake that many African brands make is they are trying to be, when they start a beverage company, they are trying to be like Coca-Cola, instead of saying, how can we be different from Coca-Cola? See, competitive advantage is doing something different, not better than the other competitors. I think African brands need to find their competitive advantage. And I think it lies in their heritage, and I think it lies in their experience, and I think it lies in their understanding of the African consumer better than the international brand. That is the one area. The second one is they should be better at telling stories than the international brands, because they understand the local consumer well. They should be better storytellers. The global brands are very good storytellers. They know how to connect with the consumer. Of course, the other key is investment. They need to invest. So invest, differentiate, and tell better stories. And most importantly, understand that you are building a brand for the long term, and it's a marathon and not a sprint.
Okay, great. We have a great recipe for growth in the future. Another interesting question. We've seen that during the crisis, there were some issues in the international exports, for example, for products. So according to you, what are the opportunities that this crisis of COVID has created for local brands?
So I missed that question again earlier. There was crisis in what?
Like caused to the COVID, there were some issues in the international export, for example, in international business, because some frontiers were closed. So how much this created some opportunities for local brands? Have you seen some changes, some trends for local brands that grew thanks to this crisis?
So what happened is, let me use one example. Let me use tourism as an example. So when it comes to tourism, these great brands are brands like La Mamunya in Marrakesh, which generally are targeted towards the international market, and charging exorbitant prices, or maybe not exorbitant, maybe they are appropriate. When they couldn't attract, when they didn't have any more customers, they now had to rethink, how do we attract the local customer? So what happened is a lot of domestic tourism grew as a result of COVID, because now they need to the products had to reimagine themselves and ask themselves, how do we now attract local customers? They had to change the product, change the pricing, change the seasonality. So a whole lot of things, a lot of reimagining. So when the markets were closed, they actually opened up for the local consumers, because a lot of times, a lot of these brands, these products were closed off to the local markets.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I don't know, regarding the time, maybe just one last question. What are your ambitions regarding to the African market? What are, according to you, again, the most important challenges that local brands have to face in order to grow and become, reach the top 100 ranking?
To me, the most important challenge that African brands face is the inability to attract the African consumer, because the African consumer has got a big problem, and the problem that the African consumer has is they don't understand that being African, being Moroccan, being Egyptian, being South African is your point of difference. Why do you want to blend into the rest of the world? So as a result, we reject who we are. And because we reject who we are, we then are not able to build on and to support our own local brands. If Africans can begin to accept who they are and support the brands that come from where they are, it will be the beginnings of a great renaissance for African brands.
Yeah. Big topic.
Very big topic, right? We'll be all year with that one.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you think we have time to do another last question, or?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
We are. Hasna is going to beat us up, but we are here.
Okay, there's another one. So I think you covered most of it, but what are the main adjustments, like during the crisis, for local brands? For example, you talk about Mamunia, but do you think about maybe another category? What these brands have done during the crisis to remain relevant and to ensure they impact their business?
Well, I think what COVID has demanded of every brand, it has demanded of every brand to reimagine itself. It's demanded of every brand to reset. It has demanded of every brand to pivot. So that's why you're seeing examples of brands around the world, whether it's Ford selling ventilators, whether it's Louis Vuitton selling sanitizers, or Gucci selling sanitizers, and all those, because you now have to think out of the box and not think within the box. So to me, that is an important benefit of what COVID has done. It has taught us to stop, to rethink, to reimagine, to reset, to review, and to restart.
Okay. Another question, more business oriented, I would say. How much the ranking is reflected in business, in market shares? Do we have correlations? Can we see similarities?
Oh, that's such a good question. You are giving us homework. We need to deal with this homework next year. Karen, that's an important homework that we need to do. But having said what I've said, of course, there's a correlation. Nike is the #1 brand, most admired. It is also the most profitable sport brand. Samsung, if you go category by category, the brands which are in the top on the list are also the brand which lead their category from a business-wise. Whether the brand is called Dangote as an industrial brand, whether the brand is called MTN, or whether the brand is called Safaricom, whether the brand is called Ethiopian Airways, you know the answer already. So I don't even need to do the homework. You know that there's a big correlation between being admired and being able to pay the bills.
Okay, great. Another one is about your point of view, or how much do you analyze the performance of the luxury brands in the ranking?
Oh, good question. So the luxury brands have always hovered around 8 to 10% of the rankings. So it's quite an interesting one when you look at luxury brands, because the luxury brands on the list, like Ferrari, like Dolce, like Louis Vuitton, like Gucci, and all those. Gucci has been in the top 10 for the last 10 years. All those brands are always in the rankings. What's so interesting is what period that we are going through now, especially during COVID, there was a lot of people buying a lot of luxury brands because they couldn't go anywhere else. They couldn't travel, so they bought a new Ferrari. They couldn't travel, so they went and bought a new Hermes bag. So there was they call it pent-up, I don't know what they call pent-up purchasing, and we write about it in the African business, which is coming out this weekend. How it's been identified, the trend of how there's a lot of purchasing of luxury brands. Luxury brands 8 to 10% of the rankings, but it does not mean that it's 10% of the purchases. It's just 10% of the admiration. Because most of the people that are being interviewed, 18 plus, can't afford the brand, do not have the brand, have never ever touched the brand. But what they have touched, they've touched what the brand promises. They've touched the aspiration of the brand. They have the only time they've touched it is when they go to the flea market or the souk market and they buy one that is not the real one.
Yeah. One thought following your point of view is, do you think there is also a link with certain categories that are probably closer to admiration, aspirational, than others? Do you see, differences between categories in the ranking in terms of proportions?
Yes, of course. But if you look at the categories, if you remember, I think consumer.
The slide, the pie.
Yeah, I think the consumer was about 20% or so, and then if you look at apparel, was probably like 8%. Automobile. So the interesting thing about the different categories is when you analyze African categories, African brands categories versus non-African categories, you will realize that the categories where the non-African brands dominate are the categories which require a lot of investment: automobile, telecommunications. So which require a lot of, and the categories where Africans dominate are the categories where you need to survive or to live: financial services, beverages, food. But what was interesting is the non-African brands also dominate the clothes, the apparel and fashion category. And the reason, and I think the reason they dominated is because we look to the international, to France, to Italy for cues on style. US
for sports like Nike.
Correct. So that's what dominates those categories.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's time to do the closure. So thank you very much again for your time and this very interesting discussion. Thank you, Karine, also for the methodology part. I hope it was clear for everyone. I will switch again in French to do the closure. Donc merci à tous. J'espère que ça a été très intéressant et que vous avez pu récupérer quelques insights intéressants pour clôturer, résumer un petit peu ce qui a été dit et ce qu'on a découvert à travers ces résultats des marques les plus admirées en Afrique. Il semble clé aujourd'hui pour les marques africaines et marocaines en particulier de s'appuyer sur une forte proximité aux consommateurs, une bonne compréhension de leurs besoins. On a vu aussi le contexte de crise tel que nous le vivons encore aujourd'hui a été un facteur clé pour justement créer cette proximité. Pour cela, du coup, une bonne connaissance de la culture locale et des insights aussi consommateurs, c'est un point de départ qui est indispensable pour avoir une offre qui est pertinente, mais aussi installer une différenciation qui permettra aux marques africaines d'émerger plus fortement face aux marques internationales hors Afrique. Il est temps sans doute, je pense qu'on en a un petit peu parlé, de se dégager aussi des benchmarks un peu trop souvent hors Afrique. On a un peu le regard souvent porté sur, comme on a parlé tout à l'heure, l'Europe, la France, l'Italie, les États-Unis. Et c'est vrai que quand on voit malgré tout quand même certaines marques africaines émerger, on peut être aussi optimiste puisqu'on voit quand même des marques locales qui font face à de grandes marques internationales. Donc, il faut continuer dans cette voie-là. Maintenant, le facteur clé de succès de ces performances, ça reste sans doute le fruit d'un investissement quand même massif autour d'une stratégie consistante et aussi d'une vision sur le long terme. On voit que les marques internationales qui performent sont celles qui sont là installées depuis de nombreuses années, qui ont agi aussi localement avec une bonne connaissance du consommateur local. Donc, aux marques africaines et marocaines en particulier de jouer maintenant cette carte-là et soyons optimistes pour que dans le ranking de 2022, les marques Afrique soient encore plus hautes dans le ranking. Voilà, j'espère que ça a été une session intéressante et pour tout le monde. Thank you again, Karine and Tebe. It was really great to have you. Thanks again for sharing this passion for African brands. Merci à tous pour votre participation et vos nombreuses questions. Un lien de l'enregistrement sera disponible sur YouTube. Donc, nous espérons que cette session vous a inspiré à construire des marques plus fortes et plus inspirantes pour faire croître l'économie et la dynamique de l'Afrique dans le futur. Merci et bonne fin de journée à tous.